to. And as part of this, it was really important to me to not only look at how can dogs use machines such as screens, but also how we can develop sort of these interfaces and interactions that are really sort of focused around a dog, because it's a sort of a grand challenge, right? Of what does dog-computer interaction look like when it's focused around a dog and in user-centered form. And so from this work, I then started to look at how we can develop internet devices for dogs that allow sort of these dogs left at home to communicate with each other. And I have to admit, I was a bit guilty here that I just moved from the UK to Finland. So I was kind of interested in how my dog could connect to his friends at home and how dogs in shelters who are left alone could connect to each other and things like this. More recently, I started to look at how we can create systems for monkeys in the zoo. So I work with Korkesaari Zoo, which is a zoo in Helsinki. And this has been a bit different from dogs, as you can imagine. It was a bit of a change across. But it's actually, I was shocked at largely, sort of largely the same principles. These things about interactions and how we can create these between a computer and animal can really be applied across in terms of interactions and design theory. And so for monkeys, I started to begin to look at how we can really form requirements for zoo animals, as this is like a very different and complex space, because with dogs, you just have the dog's owner or someone who looks after the dog. As in the zoo, you have the zoo visitors, the zoo keepers, the vets, and the animal themselves. And so after we sort of looked at all this complex space, we then started to develop music, and actually more recently, I'm hoping it's going to be published later this week, it's just been accepted, visual systems. So we looked at creating systems that allow white-faced sakis, which are like tiny little monkeys, to control what they want to watch and what they want to listen to. And here we found that technologies really have great potential for zoo animals to enrich their lives and also reduce stressful behaviors such as scratching. But there's obviously much more work to be done in these spaces. And then to summarize, sort of last month, I also started a new project with Helsinki Zoo. And I'm looking at sort of how monkeys can control technologies for choice. So I think it's very important in zoo settings that animals do have choices around what they eat, around temperature and lighting and all these different aspects. And so there's sort of grand challenges here, such as how do monkeys choose things, such as what does a monkey button look or feel like? Does the color, material, or texture matter in things? And how can animals choose something within technologies? And we as humans decide what this choice looks like and methods for quantifying this choice. And so I thought I would sort of end like the research about what I do on sort of what I'm looking forward to in the future of ACI work. And it sort of might give you a bit more of a hint around the sort of research that I'm doing at the moment. So in the future, I'm really excited for the possibilities of animals actually being online. So more of this dog internet and animal internet sort of stuff I was talking about before. I really think that technology has such high potential actually for allowing animals to be online and take control of their lives and give them more possibilities. And so in the future, I really see technologies that would allow animals to not only interact with computers, but use computers to interact with each other and also with the environment around them and with humans to create this more connected world. And so in this world, I sort of see us as designing and building technologies with animals in a way that's sort of friendly and user-centric and involves them in the process. And this is all sort of key topics that I'm excited for. So I hope that sort of made some coherent sense along the way. And yeah, that's sort of like a summary of everything I do research with. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sorry.
It's all right, don't worry.
Yeah, just caught myself swallowing some water, obviously. Thank you for that. It was really interesting. Could you, the next person on my list is Patricia. Would you mind saying a little about yourself and your research?
Yeah. Hi, if you don't mind, I think I can share my screen from here. Let me check.
Perfect.
Can you see it now? If you can just confirm that.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, perfect. So, hi, my name is Patricia. Thank you very much for the invitation and thanks for attending this panel. I started more or less like Elena. I think it was in 2013, 14.
I think you also have your sound on. Oh, I clicked the YouTube link. It's my fault. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Don't worry. So yeah, as I was saying, I think I started more or less at the time as Elena in 2014. I started my PhD thesis in animal-computer interaction, but I was actually working during my master's in human-computer interaction. So for me, it was also this kind of shift of the way in which you think and you approach your research. And I usually think that if I started now my PhD again, I would think so differently, because you learn so much along the way when you work with these different species. So I just wanted to show you quickly a bit about the research I've conducted, in case if it's helpful for discussion. So we started trying to look at how we could build interactive systems for animals that they actually enjoy and that actually use technology that is intended for them, or at least that they can understand. Because usually what historically happened is that animals were using technology, and they still use technology that is meant for us and has been designed for us as humans, for our physical behavior, our mental perception of the world. So we wanted to see if we could adapt some of these technologies in a way that animals could understand it, or at least could enjoy it, and create something that was meaningful for them and not just for us to watch. So we started looking at different technological approaches or devices, such as projections on the ground, sound stimuli, different kinds of robots, and trying to see which kind of interactions between the animal and the device or the projection were more interesting for the animal. So in this case, we had a very wide range of behaviors, but mostly the common behavior with cats, which was the species we started working with, was that they play by hunting. So that was the common behavior we found, besides all the personality traits and preferences that each cat had. So with that in mind, we tried to think, okay, how could a system, when we are not at home, or when you have animals in sanctuaries or shelters that are alone and require this physical and mental stimulation, how can we create an interactive game with these devices that can make sense for them, based on this playful behavior, this chase that cats start with the toys that you put around them. So we usually observe what the animal is doing. So then how can a system know that? We thought about the system that could observe also these behaviors and adapt to them. And we used the depth-based sensor to track the animal's movements and postures when they were playing, to see if we could identify in which posture and in which area was the cat looking at. So for example, if you know where the cat is looking at, you can put the robot in that area and start moving it. And if you know the posture, maybe you can see if the animal is actually waiting for the robot to move, if he's in a hunting position, or if they are looking around, not interested at all. So with those things in mind, we did, I think it was 2 papers on machine learning classifiers trying to better recognize the postures and body parts of these animals, as you can see. Here are more examples of different postures. As I mentioned, for example, you have the cat here, like jumping when they try to grab something on. And yeah, that was pretty interesting to go a step further and see if we could create these interactive experiences for them based on these behaviors. And also you can adapt this approach to different species. So we tried it with lions in Melbourne, and then we moved to dogs. So for this study, we created an interactive game, really basic interactive rules, like if the dog moves away from the robot, then the robot goes towards the dog, or if the dog is not looking at the robot, then the robot starts making some kind of lights and movements. And in here we had 2 modalities, one in which the system was autonomously playing with the dog by recognizing its movements, and also a remote modality, because we were interested in comparing how could the system match the things that we see and the ways in which we adapt to the animal's behaviors. So we did a remote game for children in hospitals who are there and cannot leave the room, cannot have therapy animals visiting them, or even their pets. And we compared this game in which the kid was the one remotely controlling the robot to play with the dog, which is the one in which the system was autonomously playing with the dog. And we had very, very interesting behaviors. So different personalities change the meaning of the game completely. Here you have a very eager dog, and here, for example, you have a very social dog, which waits for the robot to act kind of more socially, or in a way in which he understands that they have this communication. And yeah, another of the things we did was some work at Melbourne University here, similar to what Elena was mentioning about trying to evaluate the preferences of animals in a restricted context. So giving them enrichment, and also being aware that the technology you can put in these environments has to be very well selected so that you do not harm the animal at all. Because, for example, here we did not place any interactive elements inside the environment because these orangutans, for example, are really strong and cannot grab them. So we had to move towards these computer vision interfaces in which the system recognizes again the inputs of the system to generate sounds. So yeah, that's more or less it. Sorry if I rushed over it, and I hope you understand more or less the different ideas and connection between the studies. And yeah, basically I'm now in between human-computer interaction and animal-computer interaction. So interested in how we could mediate this communication between us and our animals.
That's great. Thank you, Patricia. Faye, am I okay to hand over to you now?
Yes.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to attempt to share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see my screen? I get a thumbs up or yes, excellent. Right.
Yes.
So just a little bit of a quick background into me and my approach then. I often feel like the outsider in the ACI community because I'm relatively new to it. I've only been involved for about 3 years. And I work on a program with Stuart, who's also on the panel. So we can both sort of talk about our specific gorilla project with you this afternoon. But just to give you a really brief idea of what direction I'm coming from, I sit at the interface of 3 disciplines, if you like: animal behavior, animal welfare, and animal cognition. So I'm quite interdisciplinary in that way, but I'm coming from a biological training background and also psychology. And the main thing that I focus on is what you can see on this little diagram here, is where all the circles of the Venn diagram overlap. And we have what I call cognitive enrichment, which is the idea of developing a device, so a sort of physical puzzle challenge that not only challenges cognitive skills, but it also has some sort of beneficial impact on welfare. And the thing that I use to measure cognition and welfare is behavior. So I'm a behaviorist, if you like. I'm recording behavioral observations from my animals. So as you can see, I'm not really coming from a computer or a design background. I mainly work on animals that have high EQ. That's the encephalization quotient, or it's just a fancy way of saying animals that have very large brains relative to their body size. So for example, great apes and cetaceans, so your whales, dolphins, and porpoises. I work with animals across a range of captive settings. So currently I work for Bristol Zoological Society, which has 2 zoos, but I work with a lot of other zoos and some laboratory animals as well, and animals that are semi-free ranging. And then my unusual approach, I guess, that we can talk about is that I personally don't train my subjects to interact with computer technology or any devices for that matter. I choose that it should be spontaneous interactions. I don't isolate animals, so I test my animals in social groups, and there's no food deprivation or deprivation of any kind because I'm in it for the welfare outputs. And also, like has been discussed earlier today, I try and not use very many food rewards if I can as well. So I'm looking for the intrinsic motivation of these tasks rather than just trying to encourage animals to access food. I collect behavioural data and also mechanical data. So I'm interested in lining up what the animal is doing behaviourally and what the device is doing and trying to match those things up. And then finally, I'm just also really interested in attaching computers to animals as well. So biologgers. So those aren't computers that the animals are interacting with, but that computer is interacting with the animal to collect data. So that's sort of my background. And the project that Stuart and I can talk about this afternoon specifically that we work on together is called Gorilla Game Lab, which is a collaboration between Bristol Zoological Society and the University of Bristol. And if anyone wants to get loads more detail on that, I've put our social media handles on the bottom of the screen for you to go and have a look at later. These are some of the outputs that we've had from the project. So it was marrying up the sort of biological aspect and psychological aspect, welfare, animal cognition, product design, and then of course all of your computer technology as well. And we've had a little bit published on that so far, but it's sort of an ongoing project. And then my sort of thing to end on would be, where can ACI take us next in terms of still being really, really tactile? So I'm going to say something controversial now, but I'm not a massive fan of animals directly interacting with a computer screen interface. And maybe some of the other panelists agree, or maybe they disagree. But I really like animals interacting with things that are really, really tactile. And I take a lot of inspiration from games that I used to play as a child, actually. So I would love to have a discussion with people about how we can really, really keep the tactile, tangible element of these devices without just having animals sat touching a computer screen all day. And I think that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Faye. Really interesting again. Finally, then we have Stuart. Can I pass over to you, Stuart? And
unmute myself, Dan? Yes, you can.
yes. Fantastic.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Get where we want to go. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm kind of coming from this from a slightly different angle. My background hasn't actually been in animal computer interaction or working with animals full stop. So I'm the everyman in this particular conversation, coming to it from a different angle of HCI. So I'll tell you basically really about my journey, how I got into this 3 years ago. So first of all, before coming into this, I actually worked in user-centered design with children. I still do in my current role at the University of Bristol. My background, my PhD was in the development of cognitive training games and physical activity-based games. So quite niche work with kids, as you can see in the middle GIF. We had it was an extra game which was designed to challenge children's working memory and their emotional inhibitory control. So very, very niche. And that kind of trend has continued in my work since coming to Bristol. I've continued to do work in games and serious games. On the right, you can see an example of one project I'm currently working on, which is looking to raise the issue of free sugar through an embodied digital pet that we engage with through bodily play. So actually using children's saliva to give a picture of their dental health through this digital pet. So you can see the quite disparate projects here. But not all of my work has been in games. I've also worked in some slightly different ventures. So on the left, you've got an example of a project I worked on called Trove. Now, Trove was a digital and physical memory box for looked after and adopted children. And it was designed really to support their journey through the care system, to give them a grounding place and a platform for them to share memories of the past and to keep really, really important and sensitive objects safe through these transient environments. So done a lot of work with children. How did I get into to ACI? Well, if you observe the gorillas on the right, not the group on the left, I met Pete not long after starting here at Bristol, and he said to me, Stuart, I've met this really, really interesting zoo lady. She's from Bristol Zoo. She's very, very passionate about tangible cognitive engagement technologies. And she does a lot of work with puzzle feeders, and she's wondering about how we could maybe add a digital flavor to some of these traditional designs in order to make more novel and unique experiences for the gorillas at the zoo there. So I said, okay, let's see what we can do. So on the left, you'll see myself, Pete, who I know is in the audience somewhere, Faye's obviously on the panel, and a shout out to Katie Burgess as well, who I don't think is here today, unless she's lurking around. But we became the Gorilla Game Lab team. Now, Faye's mentioned a little bit about it, so I think I'll just kind of consolidate what it is that she was saying. The Gorilla Game Lab game that we made can be thought of as this structure, this modular puzzle feeder structure, in which at the top there's a food hopper in which we have nuts. I thought coming into this, layperson, gorillas may eat bananas. Apparently not. It's what is it, Faye? Is it macadamia nuts? Is that what's on the menu?
It's peanuts.
It's peanuts. Okay.
Yes.
Well, monkey nuts. Kind of, yeah, I guess it would make sense. So you start off and you have the nuts at the top of the hopper, and the gorillas simply have to work the nuts from the top all the way down to the bottom. And at the bottom, there's a little reward, window where they can pull out the nut. So with these traditional devices that they've had in zoos, quite often they don't change. You know, they're set up and they're rigid. The puzzles remain the same. And the problem with that is that, you know, you've got to respect that gorillas are great apes. They are very, very intelligent animals, much like human beings. You know, when we play video games, we get bored of the same old. You know, for those of you who know about games and know about flow theory, as one example, you know, you need to keep modulating the level of challenge that's involved in order to assuage the boredom and to keep them using the device. And this is important within the zoos, you know, when we're making devices that are designed to challenge, you know, their cognitive skills on the daily, to provide that enrichment. So it hit two bases, as Faye said. It hit the cognitive enrichment base. It also supported the nutritional enrichment base as well. So our work on Gorilla Game Lab, although it's maybe not quite as technical on the front end, to use HCI terminology, the back end is really where the technology comes into play. At the back end, what we have is we've got two different little bits of technology. We were using brake beams, infrared brake beams between the modules, and also piezo microphones that would capture normally the level of kind of vibration that was going on in individual modules. Now, what did this allow us to do? Well, it allowed us to build up a picture of how challenging each of these modules were when the gorillas were using them. So it meant that once they got to, you know, once they're completing a module without too much of an effort, you know, maybe in a short period of time and without really having to, you know, shake the module too much. It meant for us, it would suggest that perhaps that was too easy. So we could take out that module, design a slightly harder version of it, or a completely new challenge at all, and then to replace that within this puzzle box machine. So that was really what we were doing. We were also logging this data to the cloud using Arduino and Raspberry Pi devices. So it would give us this kind of understanding. And then towards the end of the project, we triangulated this data that we were getting from these sensors with data that we were getting from a GoPro that was inserted in the top right-hand side of the puzzle feeder. So we worked with another group, and I should mention them as well. Probably won't be on the call, but just in case they are here, Otto and Thilo Berghardt from the computer science department at the University of Bristol. What they were able to do was, for our footage, they were then able to use a machine learning algorithm to recognize which gorilla was using the device at any one time. So instead of just getting general feedback about, you know, how each module was working out, we could then attribute that to individuals within the troop. And hopefully for us, that would mean in the future, if we were doing this again, continuing this work, we could have individualized challenge for different members of the troop. So that's kind of an overview. One other project I should mention, because I know multiple people on the panel and I don't want her to feel left out. Elena, I've also been working with Elena over the past, don't know how long it is now, Elena, we're having trouble publishing this paper, but we'll get there, we'll get it over the line. She's laughing. So we've been also at Korkisari Zoo designing for zoo-housed animals with children. And what we're trying to do there is to close the loop on visitor education. So giving visitors to the zoo, children who are visiting, a chance to using kind of like constructionist and constructivist methods to better understand the animals there through kind of cognitive empathy and emotional empathy through design. So building technologies that they believe that would benefit animals' welfare and well-being. And that's really a wrap from me, I think. Sorry for wittering on too long. I'll pass back to you, Dan.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. That was very interesting again. So I'm sure that's raised lots of interesting questions for people already. I can see a couple of questions already popping up in the chat. Just to remind anybody who's joined late, for questions, because there's so many of you, I'm just going to ask you to write your questions into chat and ideally begin them with who you'd like to answer them. So to give people a chance to come up with some questions, I'm going to combine a question from Anne with a question of my own, because I think they go in the same kind of direction. So I thought something that's quite interesting to me about all of this is, so HCI at least talks about human-centeredness or not, and there are arguments in HCI about what this means. So I'm wondering, what does it mean in each of your work to be animal-centered, and how much emphasis do you put on that? And this kind of relates to a question from Anne and group head, who says, how do we do research in animal interaction? We can't really ask the animals to think aloud or reflect on their experience. So I think those two questions are kind of related. So if any of you wants to speak up, please do. Otherwise, I'll just point at the first person on my screen. I should definitely point at somebody, shouldn't I? This is like the first rule of sharing. You address a question to somebody. I'm learning as I go along. Okay, so Faye, for you, as the least HCI of everybody here, what does being animal-centered mean to you?
Animal-centered. Animal-centered also means the same as welfare-centered. So just to give you a definition of what animal welfare actually is, because I think out there in the public, a lot of people get confused. Animal welfare is the mental state of that animal as experienced by that animal itself. So it's not to do with how I feel about the animal, how you feel about the animal, it's how that animal feels. So that is the same as animal-centered, right? So in my mind, animal-centered study is to do with welfare. It's to do with how that animal is feeling and how that animal is responding. And then the second part of the question, well, how do you study that if you can't ask an animal, if you can't sit your animal down in a psychologist's office and say, how are you feeling today? Do you like this device? Do you not? You do it by observing their behavior and using behavior as a proxy. So we infer how an animal is feeling by what it does, and more specifically, how it's responding to what we've given it. And we can do that in two ways. We can do that experimentally by giving a piece of apparatus or specifically modifying something in the environment, or we do it naturalistically and we watch spontaneously. But behavior is the key here. Behavior is what we use to figure out how an animal feels. And how an animal feels is literally animal-centered research.
Great, thank you. Elena, how does that, I wonder if you have any thoughts on what Faye said and what does animal-centeredness mean in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was like a very good summary of everything. So I'm like, my background's in computer science, right? So maybe I come at it from a different standpoint. To me, it's just about focusing all aspects of when you create technology on the animal. I mean, it's always like working with the Sakis is really highlighted to me. It's very hard to unentangle an animal's behavior, their normal everyday behavior, their group behavior, the individual behavior, to the behavior with the technology. And so even though if you just take their basic behavior, how do you know this is a reaction to certain things? How do you know it isn't a habituation, them getting used to it, or the novelty effect, or things like this? And so I think animal-centered is the aim towards something, the aim towards trying to do this. But I'm kind of a skeptical whether we'll ever reach the fully animal-centric point, especially because our judgment on animals is based on what we see and what we can quantify or in some measurement somewhere. And so there's a lot that we don't know. And if you look at like animal science over the past, God knows how long, it changes about what we know. And then what we know, we recognize more things. So I think animal-centered is never really a definitive, okay, we've got there, we're now like fully animal-centered. I think it's a constantly developing point towards something. So I see it as a towards movement, maybe is a better one.
That's really interesting, thank you. By the way, I should say, any of the members of the panel who want to chime in and respond to anything that's said, please just do. Otherwise, I'll keep pointing at you. But so next, Patricia, I guess the same question to you.
Yeah, so I completely agree with both Faye and Elena. And regarding the thing about constantly developing towards animal-centered, that thing that's really interesting, because even when you try to stand from a point of view of serving the animal, trying to get insights from their behavior, the way in which they spontaneously interact with the technology, even if you start with this in mind at the beginning of the design process, and you reach to a point in which you have a prototype you want to try, you cannot assume that's going to work. It happened to me several times. That's maybe not going to work. And you have to continuously think, how could I even make it more simpler, more easier, more understandable for them, just based on this observation. So even if you start through the beginning in the design process doing this, when you reach to the prototype phase, you have to make sure that they get these things, and that also you always allow them to withdraw or even not interact at all. And also one of the things that's my personal opinion in this matter, but I prefer not to train them to use the system. I usually put the system in there and see if it works the way I was expecting it to work, or if we find different things that they want to do with the system that we didn't even consider in the beginning and make sense for them. So how could we adapt in the system to those reactions? And I think there are even target groups in human-computer interaction in which you also do that kind of observations. So, for example, with very little children who cannot speak, or people with disabilities or some kind of verbal problems communicating their thoughts or their experiences. So there are things we could extrapolate from these groups.
Thank you. And to Stuart, I'm just going to drop in a question. So the same question to Stuart, but also perhaps dropping in this question for the whole panel to follow up on after Stuart. So as on top of this question of what it means to be animal-centered, Sinan Jakopolgo has asked a very interesting question. While using behavior as the main mean of measurement, do we really avoid human bias while interpreting that behavior? I think that kind of reflects on what Elena said about the limits of animal-centeredness, and perhaps Faye will have some thoughts on that from a behavioral perspective. Thanks, Stuart.
No worries. So I think, I mean, I'm just reflecting on kind of user-centered design processes that we deploy with children. So with children, I mean, there's the kind of ideal where they are driving the process, they have the autonomy, they are the design partner. You know, they're telling us as designers what to do as much as we're telling them what to do. There's a flattening of the power imbalance. And I think that's difficult, certainly from my experience, you know, working with gorillas, that was a difficult thing to deploy. So for children, that's a kind of ideal, but there are different points further out from that in which we can involve them in what would be called, what are often called user-centered designed technologies. So even to the point where they're glorified testers of designs that we as designers create for them on their behalf, and then they help to refine. So, I mean, from my experience working with Gorilla Game Lab, that's a challenge. I mean, I think maybe I had grander kind of goals for it in terms of that power balance, in terms of making it more animal-centered, making it more gorilla-centered, to have much more of a kind of flatter power structure in terms of the deployment of the prototypes that we made, and then also how the gorillas could possibly contribute to shaping the designs going forward. But given the kind of, I guess, the rigid environment that the zoo's within, given some of the health and safety concerns, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, having a partnership with gorillas and you know, making something which is truly user-centered design, as we would kind of ascribe it to be within child-centered technologies, wasn't really possible. I mean, it was a case of we would have to do a lot of groundwork in terms of consulting key stakeholders, people that knew the animals best, people that could advocate on their behalf. So the keepers, I mean, kind of being akin to parents, you know, consulting parents within child-centered designs. So that's a long way of saying it's very difficult, Dan.
Thank you. I wonder if Faye, Elena, or Patricia had any thoughts on that question a second ago from Sinan about avoiding human bias during the interpretation of behaviour.
Yeah, so I can have a go at that. Yeah, so watching an animal's behaviour and trying to interpret what that behaviour means is going to bring bias, absolutely, because we're looking at it through human eyes. There's absolutely nothing that we can do to replace that. That is the best approach. How else we would do it if we're interested in an animal's cognition, if that's what we're trying to work out, what cognitive skills an animal has. How else would we do it other than to use behavior? Cognition is to do with the mental process. So all of the things going on in your brain, from perception to learning to understanding, problem solving, responding. So unless we start digging into the brain with probes or putting an animal in MRI scanners or trying to replicate neural networks and things like that, I mean, we could do, but for the type of research that we do on this panel, that's a little bit over the top. So I think behavior, it's the best, it's the most valid approach that we all have, and that seems to be the one that we all agree that we should continue using. But we always do acknowledge that we are going to be biased because we're human.
So in my work, what I try and do is I try and develop systems that also log like the interactions, if you want to call this, how an animal uses the technology. So it does things like timings, numbers, and stuff like this. And so I tend to actually use this data and the behavioral data together to try and get more of an in-depth understanding. And I do this to try and get away from this. I mean, like Faye said, it's impossible to get away from this totally, you know, you can never fully get away from this. But what I try and do is I try and get this more quantitative data directly from the animal themselves. And so that I can sort of balance this out a bit, actually. And so to try and gain like more insight.
Great, thank you. Patricia, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, for me, it's quite similar to what Elena mentioned. Coming from a computer science background, you try to measure as much as you can and quantify as much as you can from the technological point of view. But I've always had to work with, and I also recommend it to work with experts in the animal you are actually going to work with. Maybe if it's a zoo facility, people who are working with the animals there every day. If it's a pet at home, with the owners, or I had one of the studies in which we were working with animals in this daycare facility. So we were working with an expert in canine and feline behavior. So besides from the insights of the owner, you also, so that gives you the personality of that animal, the specificity of that individual, but also you have this broad view of the species. And for computer scientists, we have to rely on these insights completely.
Hi, so I'm just going to jump in because this seems like a nice point to break. It is almost 2 o'clock for those of us who have, for those who have to leave. We do have a bunch of questions that we still have. We've been making note of them in the chat. So we're going to keep answering some of those questions. But if you do have to leave, this is probably a good time to break and then head out. If you want to say some quick goodbyes.
Yeah, I'll have to go, I guess, Osama and Pete as well. But like I will be looking forward to watch the rest in the video. So
likewise, thanks for a great talk, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Me too. Thank you very much. See you later.
Great. So yes, I'll move on to the next question, I guess. So we've got a couple of questions from Paul here. that I think could go to everybody. So I think this is a nice one for people working in HCI as well as people in ACI. Paul Marshall asks, is physicality and tangibility as big a deal as we think it is? Or is it that just how animals interact in most settings as humans did until pretty recently? So can I send that one to Patricia first this time?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to send it to me.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Is that a horrible question?
No. I mean, the thing is, when I actually talk about this topic outside the technological conferences, people think that I come from a behavioral background, and it's like not at all. All the things I talk about is like the things I've heard and learn along the way. So my view of this is like quite narrow. But for me, we tried with cats, for example, giving them digital projections and even just sound stimuli, and they mostly prefer the tangible interactions. And also it happened with orangutans at Melbourne Zoo. So they had this Connecting with Orangutans project in which I joined for my research stay. And they are looking at digital projections, which the orangutans can interact with their hands, their body, and even physical objects. And they started interacting with physical objects they had around with these projections. So we also kind of moved towards this more tangible experience to see if that was something that they were interested. But yeah, you see, I'm not sure. So you see these preferences, but with tangible objects, I'm not sure if it's because they are not used to understand these digital screens or the ways in which we interact, or even the devices. If you use tablets or phones or screens, it's a limited space, so it's not something they can interact with, and it's something that's meant for us to grab, and they cannot hold them as well. So yeah, maybe it's a mix of both. And I think from a behavioral perspective, then you could have more answers in this than myself, which is just from my own personal experience. They usually prefer the tangible interactions.
Great. So maybe Faye, from a sort of having the background in psychology or in cognition, how would you address that?
Yeah. So just to add to the orangutan study that Patricia was just mentioning there at Melbourne Zoo. If anybody's interested and would like to take a deep dive into that study, I noticed that they've just had that research published in Zoo Biology about a week ago. So if anyone who's interested, I'm sure if you just Google digital enrichment orangutan 2021, it will come up, and hopefully if you have paper access, you can go and read that. But Patricia's absolutely right. They found that from just giving light projections to the orangutans, they were trying to make it tactile. The orangutans were bringing in physical objects to try and up that sense. And I guess the reason why we decided to do tactile stuff with the gorillas at Bristol Zoo was because the alternatives were that we could have done something physical, so we could have tried to stimulate the animals' activity levels in their enclosure and have it as a more physical thing, or we could have tried to stimulate their social senses. And the reason we didn't do either of those things, the physical one, was that the keepers were worried about safety and worried about the gorillas traveling around too much, which would have been difficult to manage from a logistical point of view, and also for us it would have been difficult to track what they were doing if they were moving around. And the social aspect was because the gorillas have got a really detailed, fascinating social life anyway because of their social structure, and the gorillas at Bristol breed very well, and we didn't want to tinker with that. So we recognized that they didn't need any more social challenge, they didn't need any more physical challenge. What they needed was the tactile element that was missing. So that's why we did it. So I think it is a big deal if it's missing. So the important thing is you need to go and look at each animal that you're working with and say, okay, what's missing? What do we need to develop? Rather than just going there and messing around for no good reason. identify what aspect or what modality is missing that you can develop these technologies for and do that. So it's not that it's better, it's not that tactile is better than any other modality, it's just the one that we specifically wanted and felt was most important to work on with the gorillas.
That's really interesting, thank you. Do any of the other panel members have anything to add on that question?
It was just really to say, Dan, I mean, I think with Gorilla Game Lab, we were kind of steered away from that approach, from looking at what had been happening with the Connecting with Orangutans project in particular. And I was lucky enough to go out and meet Sarah Weber and have a discussion with her, just at kind of the start, the foundation of the project. And for me, it was telling when, you know, she was talking about these digital projections, and I know Patricia's mentioned this as well. And the orangutans would actually take hay and other objects inside and interact with the projections using these physical items, using these, I guess, objects that they may be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Faye, but objects they would be used to using for play purposes naturally. I mean, like throwing hay, throwing all sorts of stuff. We won't go into the, you know, the gory details. Is a playful interaction that they have within the social group. And so just what Faye said, you know, anything that would have upset the balance, or maybe have produced something where it wasn't entirely clear what the social kudos, particularly with gorillas, what the social kudos was around this new technology, could have been something that could have been quite upsetting. Now, we saw when we introduced the Gorilla Game Lab device, there was, even with something which was a puzzle feeder, which wasn't 100 million light years away from what they'd been using before, we saw there was a pecking order. And at times, it was something that became quite heated. Now, I could show you the, you know, the videos of, you know, Big Jock the silverback, when he wanted to explore, you know, see what this thing was. Now, the gorillas that were using it, they got out of the way. That was, you know, that was his domain. So had it been something that was a bit more invasive, something that he wasn't too sure about, well, you know, the whole troop could have been suffering as a result. So I think for us, it was a case of playing it safe and trying to fit within the kind of vehicle of technology introduction that already existed within the zoo, to be honest.
That's very interesting. That last point brings me very neatly to something I wanted to ask, which I'm going to connect it to a question from Lizzie. So you've got an example there of Big Jock with his, you had an example there where you had to think about the group dynamics. And it's one thing looking at this research, and when I first talked to Elena about some of this earlier last year, is that HCI is quite an individualist discipline in a lot of ways, and a lot of our focus is on individual behaviour. We do, of course, we have CSCW and group stuff, but I think we're inherently quite individualist. And I wonder if that's something that changes when you have to look at ACI, whether there's I mean, for certain animals, obviously, I don't think any of you are doing human bee interaction, but presumably interacting with an individual bee might not be the most interesting source of study. So are there, do you think there's a shift, a move from individual to group when you start looking at ACI, or is that just something I'm imagining? I guess Stuart first, as somebody who's coming from HCI primarily.
Yeah, oh, good question, Dan. You've got me on the ropes here.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think, to be honest as well, with animals, it's thinking about the species as well. So it's quite easy to just kind of broadcast, you know, ACI. Actually, having an understanding of the species that you're working with, in general first. You know, for us, for Pete and I in particular, we had to do a lot of reading. We had to read a lot about the Western lowland gorilla. We had to understand them first, but it quickly became apparent there were different personalities within the troop. You spend 5 minutes with them, you can, you know, there's gorillas that are more serious or gorillas that are more playful, and it was always going to be the case, I think, that whatever we made was going to appeal to some segments of the troop over compared to others. So I think for me, the next stage where I would have liked to have taken that project, and I kind of alluded to that before when I was talking about the design and talking about the modules and talking about recognizing individuals and how they would interact with the design, would have been to have had something that every gorilla in the troop could have used. You know, we talk about inclusion with kids, and it's quite funny to kind of transpose the ideas towards a gorilla troop, but it's very true. I would have felt bad, you know, if one gorilla had completely dominated the device for the whole time, and we wouldn't have been able to have used technology in a way that would have improved the well-being in the lives of the entire group. So I think, I mean, there's a part of that that's on you as a designer as well. There's a bit of pressure, much as it would be, you know, if you're working with kids or any other group.
Thank you. I wonder, do any of the other panel members have any thoughts about that as the question of sort of a shift towards thinking about the group in animal-computer interaction, and perhaps also connected to that, this question from Lizzie about how you deal with animals that are traditionally thought of having less cognition or express cognition differently. And I guess that might be related to kind of more group-based behavior.
I can go for it, I think. So I think it would probably appear that I'm guilty of speciesism, and I just pick the animals that have the biggest brains, thinking that they deserve the technology the most. I will defend myself and say that I study the species that I've studied for a really long time. So I used to work in a dolphin cognition lab, and I have an MPhil in biological anthropology. So I've done loads of work with chimpanzees and gorillas years before we did this collaboration. So it's definitely not the case that these ACI ventures should be used for certain species and not others. Every animal has cognitive abilities, and it's important to remember that they're supremely adapted for their own environment. It's just a case of finding out exactly what that animal needs and using the correct technology to harness whatever it is you're trying to harness. So yeah, I think that's what the question, I'm just reading, you know, how would you adapt these technologies for animals that have different cognition or a lower cognition? I think no animal's cognition is lower than any other. It's just different. It depends what the animal's adapted to do. And yeah, the sky's the limit. These technologies can be developed for across the entire animal kingdom. You just get these little pockets of people that specialize in certain species from whatever reason, just because that's their background. So yeah, in my case, I just came with that background already. But loads of animals in a zoo setting, this could be used for. We just need more people to join the community, I think.
Great, thank you. Did anybody else have any thoughts on that, or would you like me to move on to another question?
Yeah, just a quick comment on the thing about shifting from the individual to the social. I think it's very clear when you see animals in a social group, for example, at a zoo or a sanctuary, like gorillas or orangutans, etc. But it also can happen at home. So if you have, for example, different cats at home, they also have their roles at home and their social behavior. And there are really nice studies coming up in ACI that try to evaluate how, for example, a wearable device could affect the interaction from a specific animal and even from the interaction between the different animals at home. So you also have these things to consider when you work at really restricted scenarios like 1-2 animals. Yeah, it's something that maybe we as humans can explain to each other what a technological intervention is and how that affects our role within the group. But then for the animals, it's just something that you place in there. You cannot explain to them anything that we as humans could consent and talk about beforehand. So
I think just building that, Patricia, one of the things that we did, I mean, Faye, maybe you could build on this, is when we introduced the puzzler, it was at a set time of day where they were already used to, you know, a certain type of activity that was going on. So I mean, I don't know if that was a kind of primer for what was going to be involved with the technology. Yeah, do you remember the kind of rationale for that?
Sorry, for the can you?
This was just.
You mentioned it about the Gorilla Game Lab, or
yeah.
about
for the Gorilla Game Lab project.
So yeah, for me, it happened like the opposite. When we were at Melbourne Zoo trying to build this tangible system within the Connecting with Orangutans project, because we observed these behaviors in which they grabbed playful objects they had around, like this huge plastic ball. So then we tried to build upon that and generate sounds based on the orangutans' interactions with those physical objects. And we did not get to make this match between the movement and the sound clear enough for the orangutan to understand. So for us, it was like a device that they already know, affordances already known of that device. So you move it, it doesn't make any sound, but how do you explain to them that now you are using an object they already have and they already know that has changed its affordances? So for me, it was quite the opposite, how to explain to them that something quite similar, because it is the same object now produces sound. So yeah,
was that, just sorry to hijack this, Dan, but it's just there's a really interesting point that Patricia's brought up. Was there a point like you would describe for humans as being kind of like cognitive dissonance, in the sense like, well, you expect one thing from something and it completely changes? Was that something that came across for the animals as being uncomfortable? Did they exhibit any kind of behaviors that were negative, or?
Not at all. They just picked the object, heard the sound, but they didn't care. They didn't try to reach for the source of the sound or anything. Maybe it was because it was just a few trials. They didn't get have time to habituate to it, but no discomfort at all. Just, I don't know, they were curious, they turned around, but continue with their life.
Great. Any more thoughts on that question before I move on to another one from the audience? That's great, thank you for those. So I'll say to the audience as well now, there's a few less of you. So if any of you do have a question that you'd like to ask in person and you can't be bothered to type it all into chat, just write something like, I have a question, and I'll go to you. So in the meantime, one here from Nathan Anderson. So this is, he says, I think this is mainly focused towards Faye because it mentions from a biological background. So do biologists accuse ACI researchers of anthropomorphizing their subjects?
Well, I think I'm probably one of the minority of biologists that actually has become aware of the ACI community. It's really niche. I think if you're outside it, you're like, what's that? I've never heard of it. So actually, I think your community is really small, and not a lot of people in other disciplines know about it yet. I can see that it's changing, particularly with the paper that just came out on the orangutans. It's going to go out there into the zoological community, but it's going to take a few more years yet. I can tell you a couple of things that I felt weird about when I started doing this research. So Stuart and Pete's sort of background is to, actually design a product with the client, and in this case the client is the gorilla, and you try and enter a dialogue with the client to work out what type of product they need. And to do that, you need these iterative little design steps, these little mini hops. And for me, that was really uncomfortable, and I didn't want to do it because I'm used to providing an animal with a final product. What I don't want is to give the product in tiny little steps, and then by the end, when they get the final product, they're bored of it and they're habituated to it, because I like to give them these things that they've never come across and they can spontaneously problem solve, because that's the ticket in terms of welfare. That's the golden ticket, is to give animals a challenge. What you don't want is to give them something they've experienced in many iterations before. So that was probably the most uncomfortable thing. And then the second thing is how things get published is really unusual for me, coming from a background where you are ranked on your ability to publish in certain journals. I found that the ACI community have these, what they call works in progress, I think is a thing. So this idea that actually it's a process and it's always changing and you're always keeping on developing and developing, that's really, really different, usually in my realm of work. we don't dare talk about what we're doing that's in process or in progress until it's absolutely finished. And that could be years later that we go back and say, oh yeah, I did that thing. So those two things are really uncomfortable, but I'm fine with it now. I've learned that that's how you guys do things. But those are two things that I sort of accused Stuart of, like, these things are really weird. But now it's, yeah, I get it.
Any other, I suppose from the other side, do any of you feel accused by biologists of anthropomorphizing things?
I've had it like a couple of times in papers, but more because if you think about it, like I'm typically publishing computer science things that don't understand animal behavior or anything like this. So it's the understanding of jump, actually. But what I was also going to say is I actually don't think animal-computer interaction is a niche field, right? So this is just my perspective on it. I don't think it is such a small field. I think animals have been using technology for a long time. And I think this is just a different way of looking at it. I think actually ACI, in my opinion, is just a broader term for HCI. Humans are animals. Humans have been using technology for a long time. And we're just sort of broadening out into different animals. And so you could say goat-computer interaction is part of ACI, human-computer interaction is part of HCI, dog-computer interaction. All this is just part of a larger field that for some reason we keep siloing out rather than sharing. I think the terminology is new, and these user-centric principles applying to animals maybe is the new fit towards this. But I think, it always shocks me when I'm reading sort of these more animal science stuff, and I go back and I'm like, they're talking about user-centric design principles just in a different terminology. So I don't think it's that new of a field. I think it's just maybe a new way of processing it in.
That's really interesting. Yes, that's certainly how I was thinking about it, my tiny little entry into this. When I chatted to Elena about this last year, I think it became apparent to me how naive I was, but it was the same idea to me. Like, if you're looking at human movement science or particularly some of the more sensory motor stuff, it seems to me that it's natural to say, oh, well, this worked on an animal. But I suppose even so, there seem to be a lot of things which made the area quite different. And I guess cultural aspects that and acculturation. So I guess that leads me to another question I had, which is I think one that you kind of fed me, Elena, which is so this is really about animals as users. So humans we can easily think of as users because we've acculturated to technology, and I suppose animals are not acculturated to our technology. So this is somewhere where there is this difference between animal-computer interaction and human-computer interaction. So to what degree do you think it still makes sense to think of the animals as users, and is there some shift in perspective there? And so since you fed it to me, Elena, can I ask you that one first?
Yeah. So I think it's a complex question, right? Because we traditionally, animals were thought of as all users in ACI. We always called them users, this user. And now there's become this term, this UC was Sean Lawson first started using. He borrowed it, I think, from a HCI terminology in his interactions publication, which is the technology is being used on the animal, but the animal actually isn't necessarily aware of the technology. So you get things, these are very like common commercial devices, such as cameras, watching dogs in your home, or animals wearing trackers or things like this. And so I guess this is the differentiation between what really is an animal user in this. Does an animal need to have a certain amount of knowledge in some way around the technology to be counted as a user rather than just being used on it? And it's kind of a very interesting question to me of how do we draw these boundaries from a human perspective, because we don't really know entirely what an animal is in the situation. So it's very like complex, I guess. So sorry not to give you like a full complete answer.
May I jump in here? Because
yeah.
I think I don't know why we hesitate to call them users in some situations, because we, for example, have ambient intelligence with IoT devices connected all around, and we are passively using them. So it gathers the contextual situation, the behavioral features of the person to maybe provide us with some service we haven't even acknowledged or consent to. And also with the smartwatch or smartphone, they are constantly getting interactions from us, like in a more active or passive way. And then when you have animals using wearable devices or animals being tracked by a system, I would consider them as users of the system. So for me, the important part here is that you always give this user the ability to not interact at all or withdraw from the experiment or from the setup, and also making it non-invasive at all, in the same way as we do it for us. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that, because it strikes me sometimes that we hesitate a lot to I don't know, make this parallel between the systems that track us, and why can't we track animals and consider them the users of the system?
I guess I used it in the same way that you use the term active and passive, right? I just use different terminologies for this. So you have the same problem of what's an active user, what's a passive user.
Do you think, I suppose what I'd add is, do you think there's something about being a user of technology that perhaps goes beyond that, as being a part of a culture which has this background of technology? So there are some thinkers in the 20th century who talk about technology not being a single thing, but being a network of associations and cultural knowledge. Which, do you think there's something to be said for the reason we might be awkward about using the word user in this context is because we think that animals don't have that that sense of cultural background, and that somehow diminishes their agency in this situation? Or is that just me spieling out an idea without much knowledge?
In this case, I would also point out that I think it also relates to how we perceive them in the design process. Because even if we hesitate to consider them as participants in a participatory design experiment, because they cannot communicate in the same way as humans, that also, I think that also relates to this issue. Just to make things more complicated.
I think it's also quite complicated. I mean, again, going back to zoo environments, is that there is no, for a lot of these technologies, no single user. I mean, the keepers, they're users of this technology, although it may be to further animal welfare. They've got skin in the game because they want to further a certain welfare agenda. So who is the user then? Are they using the technology to their end, or is the animal using the technology for themselves? So it becomes quite a kind of tangled mess of who's really got the autonomy here. But I think I'd like to, echo Patricia, that in terms of the ethics, and I guess the ethics, whether we class them as users or not, as long as it's, it's ethical, the use of technology with animals, as long as there's a provision of choice and that, they're not having technologies pushed upon them, that they have no way to retreat from if they're uncomfortable in their use. I think that's the big ethical question. So for me, I'm less concerned somewhat around what we label them as within this kind of process. I mean, I think animal-involved technologies is a term that I like to fall back on. As Elena helped me coin that one, so she was laughing there. She knew I would say that. But I think that really kind of sums up what it is. It's animal-involved, but in terms of the balance between, who's actually the user, who's getting something out of this technology use. That's a much more nuanced point, and it depends on the technology, depends on the species, and depends on the context of the deployment, for instance, within a zoo, within the home, wherever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, me and Stuart have done some work together looking at how you involve sort of animal technology in children. So we cross these like really complex paths. I know you have as well, Patricia. And we spent a lot of time talking about this power imbalance, right? Because even if you have this whole procedure for consent, so for the animal to choose not to do something. If I look at technology, my dog is going to automatically be like, okay, I'm there, I'm ready, let's go, you know. So it's the same with children. If you get an adult involved, or you can mitigate this by. So I think it's like, I think consent is really, really important, but it's very hard to really just get from this alone, you know.
Thanks. Really, really interesting points. I think as an ex-philosopher, I've got overly caught up on what you call something, and what really matters is what's happening in practice. So, got a question here from I think Paul's question and Elaine's question connect. So I'm going to ask them together, and Elaine, you can tell me if they're going in different directions. So Paul earlier on asked, we're often talking about what HCI and particularly participatory design can bring to ACI, but what can we say about what ACI can bring to HCI? And I think that's a similar point you're making, Elaine. Yes, that's good.
Yeah, so maybe I could answer this. I did like a workshop once on where HCI and ACI meet together. And it was because I was part of a child-computer interaction lab where I did my PhD, and then I did ACI. So we spent a lot of time talking about these sort of bridges and interconnection to each other. I think from my perspective, kind of what has been happening is a lot of sort of methods are taken from HCI, applied to ACI, but modified so they work with animals. But what really hasn't been happening, and what I hope in the future will happen, is these will sort of go back to humans to look like, hey, we did this modification. How can this really help the really diverse users who we have in HCI? And so I think methods for me is a really strong loop around that can be done in terms of, because when you work with animals, you have to work in such a, you're forced in a way to work in such a different way and look at things in such a different way, that I think this viewpoint can really, really benefit HCI to not have an archetypal person.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel have any thoughts about that one?
How about Stuart? I'm going to throw Stuart under the bus now, because obviously, Stuart, your background with children from various backgrounds, is there anything that you've learned from the gorillas that you feel that you could feed forward into your work with kids?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of parallels. I mean, that's the thing. I see a lot of the parallels that exist between working with the gorillas and working with the kids. So a lot of the approaches kind of remain the same. You know, in terms of thinking about context, you know, quite often when you're doing this kind of participatory work in practice, you're working in a culture that's highly routinized, it's highly organized. There are very set roles, and you have to do it in a way that's pragmatic, that doesn't disrupt the norm within those processes. So there's a lot of the same kind of people involved. So teachers, for instance, in schools are like zookeepers in zoos. So they have a kind of time and place where you can go in and deploy some of these participatory methods. So that's one thing. Ethical challenges, I think that's the big thing as well. It's forced me, I think, from having worked with animals and then coming back to kids, to really, and it goes back to what Elena was saying, it's really thinking about what is really informed consent. And on top of that is what's the value that you're giving to the audience that you're working with. So with animals, you know, I mentioned it before about, you know, who's the user in terms of who's the benefit of deploying the technology for. It's the same thing that I found with kids. You know, you go in, for me, working with them, it's about how can we involve them in a process that's going to kind of close the loop in their learning. How are we going to facilitate a learning experience? Obviously, with animals, it's not really so much about learning experiences, but there's other welfare needs that can be, I guess, can replace that. But yes, no, so for me, I think there's a lot of parallels. So I wouldn't say that there's anything yet that's come from the animal side necessarily that I didn't know before. I would echo what Elena was saying in terms of it can be a bit of a fudge to take these methods that we've adopted for doing participatory design with adults, to then deploy those with kids, to then repurpose them to work with kids, and then repurpose them again to work with animals. It would be nice from coming from the inside out, and starting from scratch, starting from the ground up, within these contexts, and seeing what actually does work best within the context. So yeah, so I think there's a lot to learn. I think it's a really good question. I wish I had more, but I think that it's a process for me.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I think at that we are going to wrap it up. Have any of you got any final thoughts or issues that you think we ought to address that we haven't before we go, or are you tired of talking? Yeah, I think we did a pretty comprehensive run through everybody's questions in the audience there. So thank you everybody for coming. Thanks. This was the biggest attendance we've ever had at one of our group events. Hopefully, I can't imagine that affordance theory is quite as exciting to people as animal-computer interaction, but maybe we'll get good audiences for the next few in the series. So thank you all for coming, and keep an eye out on the big Twitter for more events like this in future then. Thank you all.